Hey folks, and welcome to the R&D Diesel channel. Today we're going to examine the fuel pump from an old body style 7.3 Powerstroke, and we're going to figure out at what point you need to upgrade this thing in the event that you're shooting for larger injectors for higher performance. Now this applies for Ford F-250s and 350s in particular from years 1994 to 1997. Stay tuned. Now these fuel pumps feature a two-stage design. You have a low pressure stage and a relatively high pressure stage. Now the way these work is that you have a low pressure diaphragm operated stage that actually sucks and pulls in fuel from the fuel tank. Now then, from the low pressure stage, that fuel is discharged into the fuel bowl where the filter is housed, and then from there, the fuel goes through the filter housing to the entrance to the high pressure stage, where it then exits out back at a relatively higher pressure, about 45 to 60 psi, where it goes through the banjo bolt and ultimately out to the fuel rails. Now, in examining this pump, assuming that the pump itself is a limiting factor in the flow rate, then we're going to examine the two possible restrictions on this pump. Now, the first one is the diaphragm stage, and the second one is the higher pressure piston operated stage. Now, the thinking here is that if we can't keep up with the flow rate of our injectors with the diaphragm stage, then we know that's the limiting factor. However, if this supplies more fuel than our piston operated stage, then we would know that our piston operated stage is then going to be the limiting factor in the flow rate of fuel to our injectors. Now, in order to determine what the flow rate coming out of the diaphragm stage of the pump is, I've built this kind of a goofy contraption that you see here. You can knock it all you want in the comment box, but it works. So, yeah. Now, one of the things I found out as I was looking at the pump is that the tappet here that rests on the camshaft takes a tremendous amount of force in order to push it down and actually actuate the pump. So as a result, I've had to build this little lever mechanism so that I could help actuate a little bit better because I'm not as strong as a camshaft in a 7.3 is, unfortunately. Now the thinking here with this setup is that the water here is going to mimic the diesel fuel as it would normally be inside of your fuel system. Now using this setup, I can actually measure how much water or fuel is going to be pumped per every revolution that the engine turns over. And so we can determine what the volumetric flow rate is coming out of the diaphragm stage of the pump, determine whether that's a limiting factor in our fuel supply or not. Now, the thinking here is that by doing this over the course of 100 cycles, we should have a lot of very consistent pumps, and that should allow us to get rid of or minimize the amount of error that we have from the initially starting up and putting the water into the tank versus taking the tube out and having some of that water maybe drip back into the tank as well. Now, as a result of the diaphragm stage testing, this is the data that I collected. Now, the thing to bear in mind here, though, is that this pump is driven off of the camshaft. Now, the camshaft is actually connected to the crankshaft by way of this gear ratio of a 1:2 gear ratio. So in other words, the camshaft rotates half of a revolution for every one crankshaft rotation. Now, this is what's necessary in order for engines to operate, and what this implies is that our fuel pump is only actuated every 2 cycles of the engine, and that kind of limits us as well. So as a result, what I ended up doing was dividing the number of pulses that we had by the gear ratio, and that allowed me to translate the volume per pulse in the pump into a volume that it pumps per every revolution. And we see we get about 9.85 cubic centimeters per revolution. Now this is great and all, but it really only matters if we compare it to the piston operated stage. So let's take a look at that next. Now, in order to determine the amount of fuel that is pumped for every pulse of the piston stage, again, I had to go about this in a little bit of an indirect manner. Now, the way I determined the amount of volume pumped was by actually measuring the dimensions for the piston inside of the fuel pump itself. Now, right here, what you're looking at is all the calculations I did in order to determine the volumetric flow rate per pulse of the piston stage of the pump. Now, these dimensions here are for the piston and the tappet, respectively, and the dimensions are in millimeters. Now, one thing to note here is that the way that I measured the stroke of this piston here is actually by looking at and examining the discoloration on these metal parts as they came in contact with rubber seals. They kind of had a little bit of a brownish color, and I came to reason that that was a result of it rubbing against that metal, and with all the heat cycles, it caused that discoloration to occur. Now, in the end, I was able to determine that for every time that this pump is actuated, this piston stage is able to move about 1.4153 cubic centimeters per every pulse that it's actuated. Now, in order to move that over to a volumetric flow rate per revolution of the engine, we got to again bear in mind that this pump is connected to the camshaft, so we have to divide that number by 2 because the camshaft spins at only half the speed as the crankshaft. So as a result, we're able to convert this all over to a 0.70765 cubic centimeters per revolution. Now, this is way smaller than the diaphragm stage, which, if you recall, was about 9.85 cubic centimeters per revolution. So we can clearly see here that the piston stage is indeed the limiting factor in our pump. So at this point, we've established that the piston stage of the fuel pump is a limiting factor in our fuel supply. And we've calculated that it can supply 0.7077 cubic centimeters for every revolution that the engine spins over. Now, in order to truly answer the question as to how adequate our fuel pump is, we need to figure out how much fuel do our injectors require to begin with. Now, if we take a look at the inside of a fuel injector, we'll notice a few interesting parts. Specifically, let's take a look at the plunger and barrel and intensifier piston. Now, these are the parts that are most commonly modified to make higher performance injectors, but this has a big implication on the amount of fuel that's demanded by the injectors. Let's take a closer look. Now, inside the fuel injector is the plunger and barrel assembly. Now, these are the components that actually do the work of putting tremendous force on the diesel fuel to inject it to extremely high pressures into the combustion chamber. You can kind of think about the injector as being almost like a miniature engine with only one piston in it. But just like your engine, we need to fill it with some sort of fluid, in this case, diesel fuel. So you can visualize that there's this cylinder of diesel fuel that's present inside every single injector. We effectively need to make sure that we can fill this up in the event that we're maxing out the injector flow rate and we're dumping all the fuel out of it as we can. Now, for a stock 90cc injector, at least stock for old body style trucks, non-California models, we can figure what this volume is. Now, you run the numbers and this turns out to be about 0.09088 cubic centimeters. Now, this is certainly a very small number, but let's work with this a little bit further. Now, if we figure that each injector, whenever it fires, completely empties out all of its fuel reservoir, then we can figure about how much fuel is necessary to supply all 8 injectors for every combustion cycle. Now, this is reasonable because the stock injector nozzles actually flow more than the injector capacity is. So it is feasible with nothing more than an aggressive tune, we can completely empty out the injectors. Now, if we consider that every 2 revolutions are 720 degrees, all 8 of our injectors will fire, of course, assuming your engine is firing on all 8 cylinders. Now, we know that for every 2 revolutions that the engine spins over, our piston stage of the pump only pumps once. Now, since we know the volume that's required to fill each fuel injector, we can then multiply that by all 8 injectors and figure that over the course of 2 revolutions, or for every 1 pump piston stroke, then we require 0.7271 cubic centimeters of diesel fuel. So at this point, we figured that the injectors need 0.7271 cubic centimeters of fuel for every 2 engine revolutions. Now, as we found before, our fuel pump can supply up to 1.4153 cubic centimeters per every 2 revolutions. Now, this translates to basically twice the amount of fuel as is required by the injectors. Now, this is good news as it means that we can indeed run bigger injectors without upgrading the fuel system. Now, you do a little bit of math here, and that translates about to a 175cc injector. So that means that probably about a 160cc capacity injector is about the limit before you really need to start looking at fuel system upgrades. And there we go, we have our answer. Now, bear in mind, that limit of about a 160cc injector is really all just theory. In fact, all we've done here is really just find the fundamental limit as to what that fuel pump can actually supply. So in a real-life scenario, your actual limit is actually likely going to be slightly less than what we've calculated theoretically due to other inefficiencies that we're not accounting for. Now, folks, bear in mind that this video isn't necessarily the end-all, be-all. In fact, today all we did was look at the mechanical fuel pump on a 7.3 Powerstroke specifically. Now, this was all theory, and there's, in fact, a lot of aspects to this fuel system that we didn't even take into account today. Now, at the very least, I think this does go to show that the mechanical fuel pump does have its limitations, and there's a certain point at which, if you're going for high performance, you're going to need to upgrade that fuel system. In the meantime, folks, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned just as much about the fuel system as I did, and I hope you enjoyed it, and take care. Thank you very much.